The jungle was alive with shadows, a suffocating silence broken only by the hum of insects and the rustle of leaves. Suddenly, gunfire erupted like thunder. Bullets shredded the air, tearing through branches and men alike. Soldiers scattered, their shouts drowned by the deafening chaos. Explosions lit the night sky in blinding flashes, revealing faces twisted in fear. Amid the chaos, one man stood firm, Colonel James Braddock. His eyes scanned the tree line with the cold precision of a predator. But even the strongest hunter can be cornered. Surrounded, outnumbered, and betrayed by the very terrain he thought he knew, Braddock was forced to surrender. His war was far from over. It was only beginning. Dragged through the mud, Braddock's hands were tied so tight the ropes cut into his flesh. The enemy soldiers shouted in a mix of Vietnamese and broken English, mocking the fallen American officer. Rain poured down, washing blood and dirt into his eyes, but he refused to bow his head. One soldier slammed the butt of a rifle into his stomach, forcing him to collapse on his knees. Another pressed a bayonet to his throat, just enough to draw a thin line of blood. Braddock did not flinch. His silence enraged them even more. The jungle around him felt like a coffin, every sound, every step pulling him deeper into a nightmare. Behind him, other captured soldiers staggered in chains, their spirits broken. But Braddock's jaw remained clenched. They could strip him of weapons, freedom, even dignity, but never his will to fight. That night, as they marched toward the camp hidden deep in the jungle, Braddock made a vow in his heart. If I ever leave this place, it will be in flames. The march ended at dawn. A thick mist clung to the trees as the prisoners stumbled into a clearing. Before them rose a fortress of bamboo and rusted steel, a prison camp carved out of the jungle, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers with armed guards. The gates creaked open like the jaws of a beast. Inside, the ground was scarred with trenches, cages, and crude shacks, barely standing under the weight of decay. The stench of sweat, blood, and smoke hung heavy in the humid air. Braddock and the others were shoved inside, their chains rattling with every step. Emaciated prisoners watched silently from the shadows, their hollow eyes filled with despair. Some looked like ghosts who had already died 100 times, their bodies broken but still breathing. A guard barked an order, and the captives were lined up before a wooden platform. Braddock raised his head and saw him, Colonel Yen. Dressed in a crisp uniform, his posture calm and controlled, Yen's cold eyes surveyed the new arrivals like a butcher eyeing livestock. Braddock felt the weight of that gaze, but he didn't lower his eyes. In that silent moment, a deadly rivalry was born. Colonel Yen stepped forward, his boots striking the wooden platform with sharp, deliberate echoes. The camp fell silent. Even the jungle seemed to hold its breath. His voice, calm yet venomous, cut through the humid air. "You are not soldiers," he declared, his accent sharp but clear. "You are criminals. The Geneva Convention does not protect you. Here, there is no law, only my word." He gestured toward the cliffs and dense jungle surrounding the camp. "Escape is impossible. Mountains, rivers, traps, death waits beyond every path. This camp is your grave, unless—" He paused, eyes narrowing on Braddock. "One of you confesses. Admit your crimes, betray your country, and perhaps you may live." A murmur ran through the prisoners, fear flickering in their eyes. But Braddock's face was stone. He knew this speech was a game, psychological warfare meant to break their spirits before the real torment began. Yen's lips curled into a thin smile. "You will find that here survival has a price, and I always collect." The soldiers were shoved back into line as Yen turned away, leaving only silence and the echo of his chilling promise. Days blared into nights with no sense of time. The camp was a machine built to grind men into dust. Prisoners woke before dawn to the crack of whips and the bark of orders. Their meals were nothing but thin rice water and scraps unfit for animals. Every corner of the camp reeked of despair. The barracks were dark, overcrowded, crawling with insects. Men coughed blood into their hands, their bodies rotting from disease and malnutrition. Some prayed quietly, others stared blankly at the dirt floor, already broken inside. Guards patrolled with cruel amusement. They forced men into back-breaking labor, hauling logs, digging trenches, building structures that would soon decay in the relentless jungle. Any hesitation was met with beating so severe that sometimes the victims never rose again. Yet Braddock remained unyielding. He studied everything: the patrol patterns, the guards' routines, the weak points in the fences. At night, while others collapsed in exhaustion, he sat awake, memorizing the rhythm of the camp. The others whispered about him. Some called him reckless, others called him hope. For in a place where survival seemed impossible, Braddock's fire refused to die. In the suffocating heat of the barracks, whispers carried more weight than bullets. At night, when the guards retreated to their towers, the prisoners exchanged murmurs in the dark, some about home, some about survival, and others about betrayal. One soldier, thin and trembling, hissed through cracked lips, "If Braddock would just confess, we'd all be free." His voice dripped with desperation. Another spat back, "Confess. That's not freedom, that's surrender." The argument ignited sparks among the men already fractured by fear. Braddock listened in silence. He saw the weakness spreading like a sickness. Hunger made men fragile, but despair made them dangerous. Colonel Yen didn't need to break bones when he could turn prisoners against each other. The most bitter voices accused Braddock of arrogance, claiming his defiance would cost them all their lives. Others defended him, calling him the only reason they still had hope. The camp had become more than prison. It was a battlefield of loyalty and fear. Braddock knew one truth: if betrayals struck, it would not come from the guards, it would come from within. Each day, the camp tried to crush him: the lash of whips, the endless labor, the jeers of guards who thought him already broken. But Braddock carried himself differently. Even in chains, he stood taller than the rest. His silence wasn't weakness, it was defiance. The guards noticed. They struck him harder, singled him out for punishment, hoping to see him beg. But when the rifle butt smashed into his ribs, he only clenched his jaw. When the sun burned his skin raw, he refused to collapse. His body suffered, but his spirit remained untouchable. At night, while others whispered defeat, Braddock whispered strategy. He traced maps in the dirt, memorized the layout of the camp, and studied the faces of every man around him. He wasn't just surviving, he was preparing. For the prisoners, his resilience became a silent sermon. If one man could endure without breaking, perhaps they could too. Hope flickered again, faint but alive. And that hope terrified Colonel Yen more than any weapon. At dawn, guards stormed into the barracks and yanked Braddock from his cot. Shackled and dragged across the yard, he was thrown into a crude wooden shed that smelled of rust, blood, and smoke. The door slammed shut, sealing him in with Colonel Yen. The colonel's eyes gleamed with cold amusement as he circled his prisoner. "Every man has a breaking point," he said softly. "Yours will come soon." The session began with fists, boots, and rifle butts. Braddock's body absorbed the blows, each one echoing in his chest like thunder. Then came the water, forced down his throat until he gasped for breath. The guards laughed as his body convulsed, but he refused to scream. Yen leaned close, whispering promises of freedom if Braddock would confess his so-called crimes. But Braddock's only reply was a stare of pure defiance. His silence enraged Yen more than any insult. By the time Braddock was dragged back to the barracks, his face was bloodied, his body broken. Yet the prisoners saw something in his eyes. Not defeat, but fire. He had endured the worst the camp could offer, and still, he had not bowed. The camp gathered around a dirt pit, their chains clinking as guards herded them like cattle. Colonel Yen stood above them, his expression calm, almost smug. With a wave of his hand, 2 prisoners were dragged into the circle. One of them was Braddock. Across from him stood Nestor, a towering prisoner forced into obedience. His fists clenched, his eyes filled with shame. "I don't want this," Nestor whispered, but the guards shoved him forward, snarling orders. The crowd roared as the fight began. It was no contest. The guards had chosen Nestor because of his size, knowing Braddock was already weak from torture. Blows rained down, the dirt pit echoing with the sound of bone on flesh. Braddock staggered, but refused to fall. "Fight back!" the prisoners screamed, torn between fear and hope. With each hit, Braddock's resolve hardened. Finally, he raised his fists. One strike, then another, fueled not by strength, but by rage and survival. The pit erupted as Braddock turned the fight, his unbreakable will overpowering brute force. When Nestor collapsed, Braddock stood bloodied but unbowed, his chest heaving. For the first time, Colonel Yen's smile faltered. The silence of the camp was shattered by the thundering blades of a helicopter. Dust and debris swirled as the machine descended into the clearing, its metal frame gleaming under the sun. The prisoners shielded their eyes, hearts pounding with a mix of fear and hope. Out stepped Francois, a French smuggler draped in expensive clothes, gold chains dangling from his neck and a cigarette burning lazily between his lips. He smiled like a man who owned the world, his arrogance filling the air as much as the stench of fuel. The guards treated him with reverence but not respect. It was the kind given to a man whose power came from money, not loyalty. Boxes were unloaded from the helicopter. Rifles, grenades, crates of ammunition. In return, Francois brought women, liquor and bribes for the officers. Colonel Yen greeted him with a cold handshake. "Your timing is early," Yen said. Francois smirked. "When there's profit, I'm never late." From the shadows, Braddock watched intently. He didn't see a smuggler, he saw opportunity. Inside those crates lay not just weapons, but a chance at freedom. The camp transformed into a marketplace of corruption. Francois opened his crates one by one, revealing rifles wrapped in oilcloth, pistols gleaming under the dim sun, and grenades stacked like fruit in a market stall. The guards' eyes widened, their discipline melting into greed. Colonel Yen inspected each weapon with meticulous precision. "Reliable," he muttered, cocking a rifle and testing the weight. Francois smirked. "Only the best, enough to keep your little empire safe and profitable." In exchange, Yen offered stacks of American dollars, opium, and the promise of protection for Francois's black market empire. But their transaction was more than business. It was a pact of blood, one that chained the prisoner's fate even tighter. From the shadows of the barracks, Braddock observed every movement, memorizing where the weapons were stored, how the guards handled them, and which ones looked careless in their greed. The deal may have empowered Yen, but it also revealed his weakness. Among the prisoners, whispers began to rise again. This flood of weapons could mean their doom or their salvation. And Braddock's piercing eyes left no doubt. He intended it to be the latter. Days later, the prisoners were summoned to the yard. Colonel Yen stood tall on his platform, flanked by guards armed with Francois's fresh weapons. His voice rang out, calm and deliberate. "You have suffered. You have endured. And now I offer you freedom." A ripple of disbelief surged through the crowd. Exhausted men lifted their heads, their hollow eyes suddenly alight with desperate hope. Some even wept. Yen continued, his tone silky but venomous. "One of you has already confessed. Others may follow. For those who cooperate, the gates will open. You will be sent home." The prisoners erupted in murmurs. Some clung to the promise, others spat on the dirt, seeing it for what it was, a cruel lie. Braddock's fists clenched. He knew this game. Yen dangled freedom like bait, only to reel in more broken souls. The colonel had no intention of releasing anyone. The promise was not salvation, it was control. Later that night, as guards spread the rumor of an imminent release, Braddock whispered to the men closest to him, "Don't believe him. Our freedom won't be given. It must be taken." Franklin had been weak for days, his body burning with fever, his skin pale and drenched in sweat. Still, he clung to hope, whispering about seeing his son again, about holding his wife's hand. His dreams kept him alive until Colonel Yen decided to use them against him. One morning, Franklin was pulled from the barracks. The guards forced a steaming bowl of rice into his trembling hands. He ate desperately, unaware that the food had been laced with poison. Minutes later, his body convulsed, his cries echoing through the camp as the other prisoners watched in horror. Braddock rushed to his side, holding his friend as the life drained from him. Franklin's eyes, once filled with hope, clouded over as he gasped, "Tell my boy, his father never quit." Braddock's jaw tightened, his heart a storm of rage and grief. The men looked at him, waiting, desperate for strength, and in that moment Braddock swore silently that Franklin's death would not be in vain. Colonel Yen, watching from the platform, smiled coldly. To him, Franklin was just another piece removed from the board. But to Braddock, he had become the spark that would ignite the fire of vengeance. That night, as the prisoners huddled in silence, a guard arrived with an unusual order. He carried a single crumpled envelope, its edges worn, its paper stained from the journey. He tossed it at Braddock's feet with a cruel grin. Colonel Yen's voice followed from the shadows. "A gift from home. Read it well." Braddock picked up the letter, his hands trembling despite his iron will. The handwriting was unmistakable, his ex-wife's. With each line, her words clawed at his heart. News of a life rebuilt without him, whispers of their child growing up in his absence. And then the cruelest blow: she had remarried. The guards sneered, circling him like vultures, waiting for the letter to break what their fists could not. But instead of despair, Braddock's expression hardened into stone. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his shirt as though it were a weapon. Around him, the prisoners watched in silence. To them, the letter was meant to humiliate. But Braddock's eyes burned with a new fire. If Yen thought a broken heart could shatter him, he had underestimated the strength of a soldier who had nothing left to lose. The camp was quieter than usual that night. But beneath the silence, something stirred. Not fear, but defiance. Franklin's death and Braddock's unbroken resolve had shifted the air. Men who once stared blankly at the ground now whispered in corners, their eyes flickering with a dangerous spark. One prisoner leaned close to another. "If Braddock has a plan, I'll follow him." Another nodded. "Better to die fighting than rot here like dogs." The idea spread like wildfire, invisible but unstoppable. Braddock noticed the change. As he limped through the barracks, he caught their gazes. They didn't need speeches, they needed belief. And with every silent nod, every clenched fist, he saw belief rising where despair once ruled. Colonel Yen, perched in his tower, sensed the shift as well. His sharp eyes scanned the camp, suspicion curling in his chest. He had ruled with fear for too long not to recognize the scent of rebellion, but Yen didn't know that the rebellion had already taken root. In the shadows of his own camp, seeds had been planted, and soon they would bloom in fire. Late into the night, while the guards grew lazy with drink and smoke, Braddock gathered a small circle of prisoners in the darkest corner of the barracks. His voice was low, sharp, every word a command forged from desperation and steel. "There's only one way out," he whispered, "through fire." He outlined the plan with ruthless precision. Study the guards' shift changes, exploit their greed, and steal from the stockpile of weapons Francois had delivered. Hidden explosives would become their equalizer. They would strike fast, strike hard, and vanish into the jungle before the camp could recover. The men listened with wide eyes, torn between terror and hope. For months they had dreamed of escape, but Braddock was giving them more than dreams. He was giving them a map, a purpose. A young soldier asked, his voice shaking, "And if we fail?" Braddock met his eyes without hesitation. "Then we die as soldiers, not as slaves." In that moment, the rebellion was no longer just whispers. It was a living force, beating in the chests of men who had nothing left to lose, but everything to fight for. The next days became a silent war of preparation. Braddock and a handful of loyal men worked under the noses of the guards, hiding their intent beneath masks of exhaustion. While hauling crates, he slipped fragments of explosives into sacks of rice. While digging trenches, he buried wires beneath the mud. Every act was a risk. One wrong move, one careless glance, and the plan would collapse in blood. Yet Braddock's precision never faltered. He timed each step with the patience of a hunter. At night in the barracks, the men watched as Braddock assembled their future from scraps. Detonators hidden in bamboo tubes, grenades wrapped in cloth, and a single pack of dynamite tucked beneath the floorboards. Their eyes widened with disbelief. Freedom was no longer a fantasy. It was being built before them. "Remember," Braddock whispered, his voice like steel, "the jungle is our ally. When the fire starts, we vanish into it." The shadows of the camp hid their secrets well. But soon those same shadows would explode into light. The signal came with a single spark. A faint click, a hiss of smoke, then the night erupted in fire. Explosions ripped through the camp, shattering barracks, tossing guards into the air like rag dolls. The jungle lit up in flashes of red and orange, a storm of vengeance unleashed. Prisoners poured from the shadows, some with stolen rifles, others with nothing but fists and rage. Their chains clattered as they struck down their captors, each blow fueled by months of suffering. Braddock moved like a phantom through the chaos, detonator in hand, triggering blast after blast. Watchtowers collapsed, searchlights died in showers of sparks, and the once impregnable fortress became a burning ruin. Guards shouted orders in panic, but their voices were drowned by gunfire and screams. The smuggler Francois ducked for cover, clutching his profits, while Colonel Yen stood tall amidst the flames, his expression unreadable. For the first time, the camp belonged not to its master, but to its prisoners, and Braddock, bloodied but unbroken, was at the center of it all. The camp lay in ruins, smoke curling into the night sky, but the battle was far from over. Colonel Yen unleashed his soldiers into the jungle, hunting the escaped prisoners like hounds on fresh scent. The forest, once a cage, now became a labyrinth of survival. Prisoners stumbled barefoot over roots and stones, their bodies weak but driven by desperation. The shouts of guards echoed through the trees, followed by the flash of gunfire slicing the darkness. Braddock led from the front, guiding men through hidden trails, forcing them to stay low, to move as shadows. Every step was a gamble. A wrong turn meant capture, a misstep meant death. One soldier fell, riddled with bullets, his scream swallowed by the night. Another was dragged into the undergrowth, vanishing forever. Yet Braddock pressed forward, his eyes locked on the horizon. He carried not only his own will, but the fragile hope of every man who followed him. The jungle had become the final battlefield, and only those willing to embrace its darkness would survive until dawn. At the edge of the burning camp, where the jungle opened into a clearing, Braddock found him. Colonel Yen stood tall amid the wreckage, his uniform still immaculate, his eyes cold and unyielding. The chaos around them faded. This was no longer war, it was destiny. Yen raised his voice above the crackle of flames. "You could have escaped, Braddock, but you stayed for me." His lips curved into a thin smile. "So let us finish this, man to man." The guards held back, forming a circle. The jungle itself seemed to pause, waiting for the clash. Braddock stepped forward, bloodied but unbowed, his fists clenched with every ounce of fury and loss. They collided like titans, Yen precise and ruthless, Braddock raw and relentless. Fists struck flesh, bones cracked, and the ground shook under the weight of their blows. Each strike carried years of hatred, the torment of the prisoners, the betrayal, the deaths that haunted them both. For long moments, neither yielded. But Braddock's rage was deeper, forged in suffering Yen could never comprehend. With a roar, he hurled the colonel into the dirt, pinning him beneath the weight of his vengeance. The circle of guards watched in silence. Their master had finally met his equal, and his end. The prison camp was no longer a place of chains and despair. It had become an inferno. Flames devoured the wooden barracks, towers collapsed in showers of sparks, and thick black smoke curled into the sky like a signal to the world that the nightmare was ending. Prisoners stumbled through the wreckage, coughing, some wounded, some carrying others too weak to walk. The sounds of suffering had been replaced by something rare in that place, the cries of freedom. Braddock stood amidst the destruction, his chest heaving, his body battered. Around him, the men looked to him not just as a leader, but as the one who had torn the gates of hell open with his bare hands. Colonel Yen's body lay broken in the dirt, the symbol of fear finally extinguished. For the first time, the camp had no master, only survivors. But the jungle still waited, vast and merciless. And as Braddock stared into the flames, he knew the fight was not yet over. To truly be free, they had to make it beyond the jungle's grip, to escape at dawn. The first light of morning broke through the canopy, painting the jungle in streaks of gold and crimson. Smoke from the burning camp still hung heavy in the air, but for the prisoners, it smelled like freedom. Braddock led them to the riverbank, where the jungle opened into silence. The men were exhausted, limping, some leaning on one another just to stand. Yet their eyes glowed with something they had not felt in years: hope. Behind them, the camp burned, a monument to the cruelty they had endured and the vengeance they had claimed. Ahead of them lay the unknown, miles of jungle, dangers at every turn, and the faint promise of reaching the border. Braddock paused, scanning the horizon. His face was scarred, his body bruised, but his spirit burned brighter than ever. He turned to the men and said simply, "We're going home." The group pushed forward, their chains now nothing but broken metal left in the dirt. With each step, the rising sun caught their silhouettes, no longer prisoners but survivors marching into a new dawn. And though the war was far from over, one truth echoed louder than the jungle around them: they were free.